Chapter 2 Equilibrium. Without a sound, the left cliff face exploded. Her horse danced sideways, resisting Casey's attempts to regain control. Dust filled the gorge as rocks and pebbles scattered like hail. But the worst of the blast was kept at a distance, over 20 feet out, as Velt must have planned. Where there'd once been a vertical crevice, the small explosive tore a wedge from the wall, pushing outward to obstruct the narrow path. A small gap remained on the opposite side, where a void in the dust tried to claw its way through. The shape was indistinct, but the size was suggestive of a giant panther, or an average-sized bear. Large enough to make its progress difficult, but not stop entirely. Making a signal, the captain dismounted with 3 other men and raised a wall of shields to intercept the beast. Cassia's breath caught in her throat, thinking their best option was to wait for Tenlin. But try as she might, she couldn't find him anywhere. Her training kicked in, and her free hand fumbled to retrieve her crossbow. She laid it over her opposite arm, holding her spear sideways as she prepared to provide what support she could. The 2 men mounted beside her did the same. As the dust settled, she didn't see when the creature cleared the gap. She only saw the impact as it crashed into the shields. A second blow was directed at the captain in the middle. It drove him back a step, while the soldier on his right was thrown against the wall, lifted into the air by invisible limbs. Cassia loosed her bolt, using the man's position to direct her aim, and missed. She cursed in frustration, knowing an ascendant would have easily made the shot. Luckily, the man beside her had better aim. His wooden shaft jerked midair, blunted by the impact, and the floating mercenary was dropped to the ground. Cassia staunched her embarrassment and forced her hands to reload. The line of shields drove forward in unison. The mounted rider on her left, named Dent, spun a net in the air. It was a risky maneuver in such a confined area, but his aim was impeccable above the men's heads. At once, the mass of thick cords grew taut as it caught flailing limbs. Too many limbs, 6, maybe more. Stretching out with such ferocity, the ropes snapped in a few places. The mercenaries closed in, thrusting spears into the gaps. But there wasn't enough time. The second creature had emerged from the crack. Cassia swallowed a pit of despair, knowing this might have been their only chance to finish one off. If these creatures were too much for Tenlin to handle, what hope did the rest of them have? She glanced back at the carriage, not because she had heard something, but more from a feeling. And for a moment, she could do nothing but stare in shock. The shattered beams and rubble were rising. It wasn't fast, like when Tenlin's body fell upward, or even when he'd shifted the boulder from before. Individual rafters and struts floated up, one by one, to join a mass of debris. Loose gravel, and even a few decrepit human corpses, revolved slowly in a cloud above the ravine, like flotsam suspended in a churning river. At once, she realized this was the solution. Everything else, including their defensive formation, wasn't intended to kill the enemy or even drive them back. They were buying Tenlin time to secure their escape. Even after she understood, she was overwhelmed by the implications. The strength required for such a feat went beyond the capabilities of the average ascendant. She had only met a few others who might have even gotten close. The only certainty was that Tenlin couldn't maintain this exertion much longer.
"The way's been open!"
she yelled, though no one could hear. Thus far, the shields were proving their worth, made even more effective by the narrow enclosure. It didn't matter that a third beast had joined the fray, as there wasn't enough space to attack all at once. She waved her arms. The soldier on her right was too focused on the battle, but Dent turned toward her. Cassia pointed back.
"We need to go."
She exaggerated her lips, making them easier to read. Dent nodded in understanding. He mouthed something like,
"I'll let them know,"
before pointing Cassia toward the carriage. He was telling her to leave, in a reminder that, above all else, its defense was their duty. But instead of feeling honored, she flushed in shame. Without him saying it, she knew how useless she'd been. Her training was intended for someone with inhuman strength and inhuman speed, and it was time she stopped pretending she could make it as a mercenary. She walked her horse backward and made a break for the carriage. The horses belonging to the dismounted men stamped the ground in unease. Fortunately, they possessed enough sense not to run. The only way out was beneath the floating rubble. Cassia was surprised to find her sister in the driver's seat, only then remembering Roke was needed for the fight. In many ways, the girl was a younger version of Cassia, but with pale golden hair rather than red. Her nose was sharper and her skin more clear, save for a light spray of freckles across her nose and cheeks. Illyriel's eyes were wide as she watched the maelstrom. She appeared smaller and frailer than usual, with her long hair plastered to the contours of her neck and back. Her light green traveling dress, too, clung tight to her skin, a sight all the more odd as both her hair and clothing were completely dry. In appearance, anyway.
"Move over,"
said Cassia, stepping down from her horse and propping her spear by the seat. At this distance from the creatures, her voice was muted, but just loud enough to hear. She didn't doubt her sister could have driven the carriage. Illyriel was old enough to have learned help wouldn't always come. And she was noble enough to know when others were counting on her.
"It'll be all right,"
said Cassia, grasping the reins. Illyriel nodded silently. The only problem was deciding when to start moving. Much of the wreckage was still waiting to rise, but the terrain might never become clear enough. Not before Tenlin ran out of strength. She might have expected the Ascendant to change his approach, to drift to one side and drop off some weight. But considering the sheer number of fragments, even a single direction would consume his focus. Moreover, keeping the debris in one place was smart. To quickly close the pass once their group was safely through. Cassia decided to risk it. The carriage jostled wildly as they crossed uneven ground. The path was too narrow to do much steering, But she did what she could to avoid complications. She hoped the horse's instincts would handle the rest. Beside her, she could feel her sister's tension, as though every muscle in her body had gone rigid.
Don't look up,
said Cassia. The girl nodded quickly, still watching the sky. This wasn't Illyriel's first trip through the countryside, but it was her first attack. Her mind, no doubt, would be filled with horror stories, the ones difficult to avoid and impossible to forget. Most notably, the one that had taken their father. Cassia pulled a long dagger, still in its sheath, from her belt.
You remember how to use this?
Her sister nodded.
I think so. I mean, yes, of course.
I want you to have it.
Illyriel accepted the offering with odd reverence. She began to tuck it into her sash before she hesitated.
But don't you need this?
I still have 7 more.
The girl blinked, before looking her up and down, attempting to discern where the rest were hidden. Cassia said nothing, satisfied with the distraction this provided her sister. They were nearly a quarter way across before the carriage struck something solid and screeched to a stop. In a panic, she wondered if a wheel was caught, or worse, had broken. With a mixture of stubbornness and desperation, she tried to get the horses to push through, but ultimately it did no good.
What is it?
Asked Illyriel, clutching her arm.
Let go,
demanded Cassia, leaning away to search for the problem. Suddenly, the carriage began to lift off the ground. She heard faint screams from the horses as they resisted, but only hurt themselves more.
Oh no,
she said, looking up into the sky.
No, no, no.
But if Tenlin was to blame, pulling up on the carriage, she didn't know where to look. There were so many obstacles, she might not have seen him anyway. She jumped down, hoping for a different explanation. Suddenly, Illyriel pulled her back toward the carriage and out of the path of a galloping horse. It was the first rider to leave the battle, favoring his left arm that had been wounded. Her heart raced as she watched the man gallop away. He'd been so terrified of the debris overhead, he hadn't seen her step down. Even now he went onward, oblivious to what his carelessness had nearly cost her.
Thank you,
she muttered, checking behind the carriage if the way was clear. Crouching down, she found a large wooden beam jutting up from the dirt, caught beneath an axle. It had been buried so deep it must have taken extra time to begin its ascent. But from its size alone, Cassia knew it'd be impossible to extricate the carriage in time. Their only choice was to leave it behind.
Elle,
she shouted. As her sister stepped down, Cassia pointed to the dagger at her waist.
cut the straps. Hurry.
Illyriel turned to set the horses free. Cassia looked back, but no riders were coming. She wasn't sure what to make of this. She was glad they weren't retreating all at once, with the enemy hot on their heels. Had that been the case, it would have eliminated all chances of getting away. At the same time, she hoped they wouldn't wait too long. Once the first man died, the rest would soon follow. Cassia banged against the carriage.
Marion,
she shouted. She yanked the door open to find Marion's daughter, Chisandrel, mouthing a fervent prayer. At 12 years of age, she had long black hair and a smooth, freckled face. Her dress was brown silk and embroidered in gold.
We have to run.
Yelled Cassia. Illyriel must have finished because the horses immediately broke into a gallop.
No!
Shouted the girl, chasing a few steps after them, but it was already too late. She turned back to Cassia, her expression apologetic. She'd known Cassia had wanted those horses, not only for the ravine, but for their escape afterward. In the end, however, it was wishful thinking, and Cassia knew better than to blame her sister. Cassandra stepped down and waited for instructions.
Run!
Shouted Cassia. The girl bolted like a frightened deer. A second rider, Dent, had begun his retreat. Like the first, he was by himself. Without awaiting an explanation, Cassia grabbed her sister's wrist and waved the man down. Illyriel protested, but Cassia ignored her. Dent understood, slowing enough to hoist the girl behind him and continue his escape.
What the hell is going on?
Cassia shouted into the carriage. Marion was bent over, fumbling through the contents of a large open chest.
Hold on,
Said the woman.
this is important.
More than your life? There's no time.
There was a sudden shift in the sky above. The collected mass dropped several inches before catching itself again and renewing its revolution.
I'm sorry,
Said Cassia.
but you're on your own.
In her mind, she cursed Marion for making her do this. Then she grabbed her spear from the driver's seat and broke into a sprint. She'd only crossed half the distance before the sky dropped again, this time several feet before lurching to a stop. Or rather, most of it stopped. A small rock crashed into the back of her hood, the shock nearly causing her to drop her weapon. Something else struck her hand, drawing blood. She pushed herself faster as the bits became a shower, small at first, but growing larger. They pelted the ground in an incessant barrage. At last, she was through. She caught her first glimpse of the outskirts of a village. There was a stretch of land once used for gardening, with rectangular canvas frames to shield plants from the blood. Further ahead were scattered trees and dozens of decrepit buildings, tucked neatly between the mountains on either side. She took a few steps toward them before she turned, breathing heavily. She dropped to her hands and knees, still grasping her spear, and watched the final moments of the tower's descent. The first figure to appear was a lone horse without a rider. The second, to her amazement, had Marion seated behind him. But the third. As the rest of the avalanche came crashing down, spewing dust and gravel from the mouth of the gorge, the last had been running on foot. She hadn't seen him clearly, but she could have sworn for a split second she'd seen his legs buckle as he was forced to the ground beneath stone, earth, and lumber. His name had been Meliv, or Melvin, or damn it! Numbly, she quickly counted in her head and noticed two others were absent. Had they been further back, too far to see? Or had they fallen earlier in the heat of battle? She had trouble breathing, more than could be explained by her recent sprint. Her mind was reeling from adrenaline and loss, but also with the fury that could have only been directed at Marion. Were it not for the woman's plan, none of them would be here. And worse, her delay had cost precious seconds, time the last man could have used to escape. As the 3 remaining riders regrouped outside the village, Cassia saw it was Dent barking orders, with her sister still behind him. He was preparing to leave, in keeping with Velt's original plan. The captain was nowhere to be seen. Roke, too, was missing. Her sister began to yell.
Kay! Kay!
A man had caught the reins of the riderless horse, and both Dent and her sister were waving her toward it. Cassia hesitated.
Has anyone seen Tenlim?
She demanded, as she turned toward the rubble. By then, the sun had disappeared entirely, and when combined with the billowing dust from the crash, it was near impossible to see anything.
Last I saw, he was near the center,
said Dent.
Everything was swirling around him. I don't see how he could have...
He left the thought unfinished. Cassia herself didn't know what to think. She could only hope Tenlin hadn't overexerted himself, that he'd retained enough control to avoid getting crushed.
Someone needs to find him.
The men exchanged nervous glances, some appearing guilty. All were on edge, anxious to leave. Cassia groaned.
None of you? Really?
If we stay, we die,
said Dent, lowering his eyes. Cassia was incredulous.
If we leave him, we die.
And she ran toward the wreckage before anyone could argue. Her sister called after her,
Kay! No!
But Cassia had already made up her mind. It wasn't about orders or a sense of duty, and it wasn't about honor to help an old man in need. No, this was out of fear, because even if they escaped this pack of monsters, there'd no doubt be more. With days left to travel between these mountains and Karheim, it was a matter of time before they were attacked again. And when that happened, they'd have zero chance of running or sneaking anywhere without an ascendant by their side.
Tenlin?
She shouted before coughing away dust. She ducked a leaning pillar and scrambled over gravel. She might have taken more care, worried about accidentally stepping on the man or creating a shift in the rubble that'd make things worse. But fear gave her speed, anticipating at any moment creatures to come crawling through the wreckage.
Can you hear me?
She yelled again, not so much expecting an answer, but more from the need to hear her voice. She needed to be sure her hearing didn't change, and the easiest way was to keep making noise. Cassia looked back.
See anything?
She was relieved to find the men still there, watching from below. They knew she was right. No one could leave until they learned Tenlin's fate.
No,
shouted Dent. At that moment, she thought she heard a groan. She strained her ears, trying to discern where it came from. All was quiet for several seconds. Then she heard it again. The groan changed pitch, converting into short, shallow gasps. Cassia found the man wedged into a crevice beneath 2 beams, so obscured by dust and shadow she might have easily passed him by. It only took one glance, however, to see it wasn't good. The enormous pillars had his legs pinned, so firmly they were most certainly broken, ascendant or otherwise.
Tenlin!
She shrieked. She scrambled toward him, overwhelmed by a mixture of hope and fear. With his hat missing and his cloak in tatters, she caught a glimpse of his deformed, mangled body. His neck curved the wrong direction, and his arms were bent. But these weren't injuries caused by the fall. It was how he was, why he felt compelled to hide his shape beneath cloth and bandages. It was the cost of twisting the world to his will, that, without the protection of the gods, had twisted himself in turn. Tenlin tried to speak, but his voice was faint.
Stay still,
She instructed, dropping her spear.
I'll get this off you.
The old man shook his head, with eyes out of focus. He grimaced in pain and lifted his good arm toward the wood above him. The pillar began to move, but only an inch.
Save your strength. Just let me.
The ground trembled.
No,
He hissed, with widening eyes. He looked at Cassia as though seeing her for the first time.
you need to go.
He choked, with surprising ferocity. Only then did Cassia hear the other yells. One was her sister, sounding very far away.
Kay!
She was shouting.
Move, Kay! Get out of there!
Oh, shit.
Feeling like an idiot, she lunged for her weapon. But the rock pile shifted and she fell on her wrists. With the dust still thick, she had a clear view of the empty shapes rising from the rubble. Not in one place, but several. Worse, one of the voids was climbing from behind, blocking her escape. It was almost upon her before she reversed her grip and drove her weapon down like a harpoon. But rather than feel the penetration of hide, an enormous strength latched on to her tip and tried to yank the spear from her hands. In sudden desperation, she planted a foot against a large stone block and used her legs to pull backward and upward, then switched directions. Hoping to take it by surprise, she thrust downward and matched the creature's pull. The tip pierced through flesh and bone. She put her weight above the target and pinned it to the ground. Even so, it continued to rise. With bestial strength, it pushed back, lifting Cassia into the air. At that moment, there was nothing she could do. Her efforts had only cost her time and allowed the other creatures to surround her. Then she heard Tenlin's voice, so loud it overpowered the silencing aura.
Go!
He commanded, stretching a hand toward her. The world turned sideways. Cassia shrieked, feeling the ground slip away, no longer horizontal, but rising to form an enormous cliff face. Tenlin was above her, and she fell away with increasing speed, losing her spear to its skewered target. The ruined buildings rose fast to meet her. Beyond the village, there was nothing but endless sky. Her heart raced so fast, she feared it might leap from her chest. Was it always like this for Tenlin? How could he manage to not lose control, much less keep his wits about him? Her greater worry, however, was the realization her body wasn't built like his, and the moment she crashed through those walls, she'd break both legs. Just as suddenly, the world flipped back to normal. Cassia tucked into a roll an instant before hitting the ground. She was moving so fast, her deft reaction degenerated into an uncontrolled tumble as dirt and rock rained around her. Flailing like a doll, she was twisted, bounced, beaten, and battered, until eventually she skid to a stop. Cassia tried to curse, but nothing came out. There was a tightness around her chest, wringing her out like an old rag. She forced her head up, toward the place Tenlin had been, just in time to watch the old man die. Cassia felt sick. From this distance, she couldn't see the blood, but as gravel flew and the pillars shattered, there could be no mistake. With tears in her eyes, she saw his body ripped apart. At this signal, the men spurred into action. The riders glanced at Cassia, still lying on the ground, but none came to her aid. They had no way to gauge her injuries, and beyond that, there wasn't time. The first took off, followed by the second, galloping through the village toward the pass on the other side. All of them were leaving. All but one. As Cassia rose to her elbows, Dent was locked in a struggle with the girl behind him.
No!
Shrieked Illyriel.
I won't leave her.
Keep still,
He demanded. With one hand on the reins, he reached back with his other to bring her under control. Cassia's heart sank.
Ow.
She tried to shout, but could not put enough force into her voice.
Listen to him.
The girl screamed and pounded Dent's back with her fists. How could this be happening? The only thing Cassia wanted was for her sister to be safe, but the girl was impossible. Somehow, Illyriel forced a knee between her body and Dent's. With a mighty shove, she fell backward off the horse and landed heavily on her side. Dent's face contorted with rage and frustration, turning back toward the girl before locking eyes with Cassia. He shook his head as though in apology, before driving his horse away and racing after the others. Illyriel was on her feet, her dress streaked with mud. She broke into a run, shouting,
Tay! Tay!
By then, Cassia had risen to her knees. She wanted to scream at the girl and call her a fool. She wanted to yell something that would force Dent to come back. But instead, she said,
We have to hurry. This way.
Illyriel got an arm under Cassia and helped her to her feet. The girl's muscles were spindly, but possessed a strength that took Cassia by surprise. Clearly they couldn't run, and they certainly couldn't fight, which left a single option. They needed to hide. With Illyriel's help, they stumbled toward the buildings. As they got closer, it was easier to see the signs from earlier attacks. Claw marks gouged the walls, and there were occasional faded stains of dried blood. At the first opportunity, they turned a corner and broke line of sight. There was a slight chance the monsters hadn't noticed them, too engrossed in their momentary feast.
Over here.
Came a shout, quiet enough to avoid drawing the creature's attention. Cassia was shocked to find Marion and her daughter near an old stone building. For a moment she paused, unable to understand. Why was the woman still here? Why hadn't either of them escaped with the men? At this point, however, she chose not to care. Marion was low to the ground and holding open a wooden cellar door. Perhaps to the monastery they'd discussed earlier?
Hurry!
The woman hissed. Cassia felt lightheaded as they pushed into a run. But with help from her sister, they reached the doors without Cassia passing out. The darkness made it impossible to see down the steps, but this stopped no one from racing down and slamming the door behind them. All went black. Groping with her hands, Cassia found a heavy bar and slid it into place. She regretted the loss of her spear. To her best recollection, it must have still been lodged in that creature's body.
It's not gonna stop them.
Whined Chisandral,
Even the wreckage didn't stop them.
and she invoked another prayer,
Calm down, Chess.
said Illyriel.
Maybe they didn't see us.
Maybe?
The girl's voice was nearly a shriek.
Maybe?
Harsh! They'll hear.
This prompted a sharp intake of breath, followed by heavy breathing. Chisandral renewed her prayer, more quietly this time. Cassia spoke up.
It'll be all right. There's a chance they'll chase after the men instead.
This did little, however, to calm the girl, and she began to whimper. No one wanted to think of being chased through the night. The men wouldn't have time to catch their breath.
Won't they come back?
Asked the girl.
The men can't leave us here. They can't.
Coming back would be suicide, Chess. You know that.
Chisandral paused.
But what are we to do? They'll send for help, won't they? The ones who...
The girl stopped. All of them had heard it, the change in her voice becoming weak and muffled. Cassia stifled a groan, realizing she should have kept Chisandral quiet. Both girls pressed in at her sides, each taking hold of Cassia's arms. With her eyes more adjusted, she could now discern faint cracks of light from outside. They weren't much more than thin purple lines, the last visage of twilight. The air thickened as though her head had been plunged under water. As the girl squeezed tighter, she could feel, but not hear, the race of their hearts. In fact, Cassia could hear nothing at all. Even when she saw the faint lines shudder and dust peppered their upturned faces. The impact sent vibrations through the steps beneath them, causing both girls to flinch, but it hadn't made a sound. Though it was possible to breathe, Cassia felt like she couldn't. The surrounding pressure nearly drove her into a panic, and it took all her strength to keep herself still and stare unblinking at the lines above. The following impact nearly forced them down a step. No longer wanting the girls up here, Cassia extricated her arms and pushed them down the steps. She might have screamed at them and told them to hide, but they wouldn't have heard. Regardless, she found nothing nearby to reinforce the door. Cassia drew her knives. When the lines ceased shivering, she couldn't help but notice that some had gotten wider. The cracks splintered beneath the ferocity that followed. The doors jerked violently as the beast pried between the wood. She drove a blade upward, hoping to catch between its claws. Cassia knew the doors wouldn't last, and was confused when she found Illyriel once again at her side. This time, however, the girl clutched a dagger tight in her fist, the one Cassia had given her. Oddly, this brought a grin to Cassia's face, a momentary pride that felt bittersweet. But she never got the chance to see her sister in action. As quickly as it started, the tension evaporated. No one moved. They sat there, quiet, fearing its return at any moment. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, it became easier to believe the monster wasn't coming back.
Must have gone with the others,
Cassia whispered. She turned around and returned one knife to its sheath. She kept the other out, drawing comfort from the solid heft of its polished wooden handle. Even now, her heart didn't slow, her mind too full of things to process. It was hard to believe Tenlin was gone, among the others who'd died. And though somehow both she and her sister were still breathing, blessedly so, she was keenly aware they were no closer to safety than before. Extra light spilled in from outside, the result of widened cracks and rising moonlight. A few steps down, she found Marion's dim shape. In her hands was a wooden box, unnoticed until that moment. More surprising was that Cassia recognized the box, though the darkness made it difficult to see.
Marion, is that?
Cassia swallowed. Her eyes traced the engravings, with ornate inlays of pearlescent wood. Out here, in the middle of nowhere, the box was entirely out of place. It was rare for anyone to risk taking something so valuable from the city, let alone under the protection of such a small escort. To her surprise, some of her anger dissipated. Though she couldn't agree with Marion's choices, she could at least understand why the woman hadn't left this with the carriage. The only confusion was how she possessed it in the first place.
What's going on?
Asked Illyriel. Cassia shared a look with Marion before turning to her sister.
You've heard me talk of these bones, the ones in the box. They're the reason I needed Marion as my sponsor. But even she couldn't get her hands on them without amassing crippling debt.
The woman said nothing.
Which is why,
continued Cassia,
she returned them when my ceremony failed. I witnessed the exchange. Gods, Marion, if the clergy discovers what you've done, you won't only lose your estate, you'll be imprisoned.
Mother?
asked Chisandril with confused despair.
What's she talking about?
There's nothing to worry about, dear.
By then, it wasn't difficult to piece the rest together. Why else would the woman have kept the bones before traveling to the middle of nowhere in search of an abandoned monastery?
Marion,
breathed Cassia.
do you mean to ascend?
The Nightmare Throne by Austen Lynn Clark releases September 27th everywhere books are sold. You can pre-order it right now on Amazon in standard hardcover, paperback, ebook, as well as the audiobook you've already started listening to. The printed version features 50 illustrations produced by the author himself, including chapter headers, full-page artwork, and a double-page map in black and white. Furthermore, from right now until September 27th, a special deluxe full-color edition is available for purchase on Kickstarter. This includes the same 50 illustrations printed in color, as well as a dust jacket, custom end papers, sprayed edges, and alternate artwork printed along the case laminate, featuring both sisters on opposite sides. This version will be signed and numbered by the author in the order of Kickstarter backer number. That way, people who pledge earlier will receive a lower and more collectible number. Just search for The Nightmare Throne by Austin Lynn Clark, or check the show notes of this podcast for the relevant links.